Hello again. This is Mrs. Richardson with VS.4, Colonial America. What is a crop that is grown to sell for money rather than for the use by the growers? That would be a cash crop. In Virginia, tobacco became the best-selling cash crop. The success of tobacco as a cash crop transformed life in the Virginia colony and encouraged what? And that would be slavery, because the more slaves they brought over, the more tobacco they could grow, which led to more money. The economy of the Virginia colony depended on what as a primary source of wealth? And that is agriculture. We know that agriculture is another word for farming. What became the most profitable agricultural product? And that would be tobacco. They even started calling tobacco green gold because of its great value in the colony of Virginia. The successful planting of tobacco depended on a reliable and inexpensive source of what? And that would be labor. And so therefore Africans were brought from Angola by the Portuguese sailors and sold to people in Virginia to be used as this inexpensive source of labor. True or false? The Virginia colony was never dependent upon slave labor. And that is false. We know that they did become dependent upon slave labor and that this dependency lasted a long time. Name 3 examples of cultural landscapes. These would be types of architecture that would be found across the landscapes. Those are barns, houses, and places of worship. Tobacco was sold in England as a what? And that is a cash crop. Remember, a crop that is grown to sell for money rather than the use of the grower. Who were brought to the colony against their will to work as slaves on the plantations? And the answer is Africans. They were not African Americans yet because they had not lived here. They had only lived in Africa. They were brought here against their will by Portuguese sailors and sold as slaves. Whenever people settle an area, they change the blank to reflect the beliefs, customs, and architecture of their culture. And as we said before when we were talking about barns, houses, and places of worship, they change what the landscape looks like because of the types of construction that they build. The place named Richmond reflects which culture? And that would be the English culture. The English people gave names to their towns that were similar or exactly the same as the names that they had known in England. A good example of this is the name Bristol. Bristol was a place in England, and when they came here, they named the area they moved to Bristol. The place named Roanoke reflects which culture? And that would be American Indian. Many of the names that we have heard, such as Rappahannock, Pamunkey, Nansemond, those are all names that were given by the American Indians. The Germans and Scotch-Irish settled primarily along the migration route in the where? And that is the Shenandoah Valley. The Scotch-Irish and the Germans settled primarily in the Shenandoah Valley. In which regions could you find the American Indians or First Americans? And they were located in all regions of the state. However, we know at this time they are really only located in 2 areas, the Coastal Plain and the Piedmont region. But originally they were found in all regions of the state. The culture of Virginia reflected what 3 origins? The three origins were the American Indians, the Africans, and the Europeans. To help you remember this, we know that the American Indians were already here, and then the Europeans came to settle the colony of Jamestown, and then they brought the Africans here against their will. So, the three cultures were American Indians, Africans, and Europeans. In which two regions did the English primarily settle in? That would be the Tidewater and Piedmont region. We know this because when they came across from England, they settled here on the Jamestown area and then moved further west as time went on. But most of the Europeans settled in this area right here, the coastal plain and the Piedmont. African Americans settled primarily in two regions where agriculture required a great deal of labor. Name these regions. This was also the Tidewater and Piedmont regions because the people who purchased these Africans as slaves lived in these two regions, and so the Africans were there as well because they were slaves on these plantations. What caused people to adapt old customs to their new environment? And that would be migration and living in new areas. As the people in Virginia continued to move west and to the deep south, they changed the ideas and customs as they went with them. What factors often influence the location of a capital? And that would be geographic. Many times the geographic features of an area determine whether the capital will stay there or not. So, what are the factors that influence the move of the capital from Jamestown to Williamsburg? Remember that the drinking water was contaminated by seepage of salt water at Jamestown. Jamestown also had unhealthy living conditions that caused diseases such as the seepage of the salt water and the malaria carried by mosquitoes. Williamsburg was at a higher elevation, and so therefore the land was not as swampy. And finally, fire destroyed the wooden and brick buildings at Jamestown, so rather than rebuild all of them, they just decided to move the capital to Williamsburg. What reasons influenced the move of the capital from Williamsburg to Richmond? The population was continuing to move west, and Richmond became a more central location. Richmond's location was also better for trade, and it increased the distance from attack by the British during the Revolutionary War. The capital of the Virginia colony started in Jamestown. Tell the next two locations for the capital. And that is Williamsburg and Richmond. So the three capitals that Virginia has had is Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Richmond. What is money? Money is a medium of exchange or currency, which includes coins and paper bills. A medium of exchange just means that when you give somebody money, they give you something in exchange for it. What is credit? Credit is buying a good or service now and paying for it later. So just remember, credit is buy now, pay later. Say that with me. Buy now, pay later. What is the trading or exchanging of goods and services without the use of money? And the answer is barter. People who did not have money or things to use for that type of exchange could take things they did have to go and exchange or barter with people to get what they needed. What is a good or service owed to another? That is called debt. Whenever you buy something and have to pay for it later, it causes you to be in debt. What is money put away to save or to spend at a later time? That is called savings. savings, when you put money away to save or spend at a later time. True or false? Barter was commonly used instead of money. That is true. The people in the colonial times did not have much money, and so barter was more commonly used. What could a tobacco farmer use to pay for goods and services? They could use their tobacco. How many banks were in colonial Virginia? The answer is none. There were no banks in colonial Virginia because very few people had money, and without money there is no need for banks. True or false? Money was commonly used in the early Virginia colony. That is false. Once again, there was not much money involved during the colonial period. True or false? In colonial Virginia, few people had paper money and coins to use to buy goods and services. And that is true. Very few people did have money. Most purchases were made through barter or through credit. Farmers and other consumers could buy goods and services on credit. When did they pay their debt? When their crops were harvested and sold, they came in and paid off their debts. What forms of exchange were used in the Virginia colony? Once again, that would be money, barter, and credit. The three forms of exchange used in colonial America was for money, barter, and credit. People living in colonial Virginia depended on what three resources to produce the goods and services they needed? That would be natural resources, human resources, and capital resources. What rights did enslaved African Americans have? None. They had no rights at all. However, free African Americans owned their own businesses and property, but were denied most what? And that was rights. Even though they could have their own businesses and their own property since they were free, however, they still were not given many rights. How did most white Virginians make a living in colonial Virginia? They had small farms and they lived from the land as farmers. Most people did not have those large plantations with many slaves. Most farmers in Virginia had small farms and lived from the land. Food choices were blank. And the answer is limited. They were limited because they only had what they could grow, what they could gather, and what they could hunt. They could not go to the local grocery store and get things out of season. What type of houses did most people live in? One-room log houses with dirt floors. One-room log houses with dirt floors is where most people lived in colonial Virginia. Thank you for your time. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. Please use it as you need to prepare for the SOL test.